general manager at 3,000 Acres. We're an urban agriculture charity based in Melbourne, but today I'm here to help out with Moreland City Libraries, talking a little bit about backyard poultry. So before I kick off, I did just want to take a second to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people as the traditional custodians of the land and waterways in the area that we now know as Moreland, and pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. And particularly as someone who grows food, it's so important to me to acknowledge the very long but often unacknowledged aspect of Indigenous people growing food and cultivating this landscape, which I learned a lot about for the first time by reading the book Dark Emu by Bruce Pascoe, which I cannot recommend highly enough for any of you who haven't had the chance to read that one. So as I said before, my name's Morgan, and I have long been a fan of the feathered friends that we keep in our backyard. I've owned chooks and quails at various times, and I think that they are one of the best things that you can possibly do for your garden and for your mental health, because there is nothing more fun than having some feathered friends in the backyard. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the 101 of deciding to get some poultry for your backyard setup. So what's it going to cost? What sort of resources are you going to need? And where to from here, if that's something you want to add to your system. So as we go through, please do post any questions that you have below. If you've had an issue with your chooks, if you're curious about a particular breed, if there's something that's held you back from adding chooks or quails to your system, comment below and I'll answer those questions at the end of the feed. So the first thing that I just want to acknowledge is that often when people think about a bunch of chooks running around, they don't imagine that in an urban area. But the truth is that there's actually a great deal of chooks and quails and some other creatures as well running around in people's backyards around Moreland and other urban areas. They're absolutely a creature that can fit into that space, and with the exception of roosters, probably won't bother your neighbors all too much. So some of the reasons that people decide to get chooks or quails for their space are, of course, first and foremost, eggs. That people want to know that the eggs that they're using when they're doing their cooking are coming from chickens that they trust have been treated properly. And a lot of people have kind of some of those concerns around both what's being fed to those chooks, how are they being treated, and some of the ethical considerations there. But there's other reasons as well that you might want to add poultry to your space. For me, a huge part of adding poultry was closing the loop on my garden. Here I was producing all of these beautiful leafy greens, and I was eating those in a lot of cases, and as well as I had worm farms and compost systems going, but I wasn't producing any of my own fertilizer for the garden. And in a lot of cases, I was overproducing food and didn't have anywhere to use it. With chooks or with quails, you totally close that loop. You're producing some food that you can share with your chooks and your quails, even some table scraps as well from inside. And in exchange, they're producing nutrients for the garden in the form of their waste, as well as eggs that you're able to enjoy inside. For me, another big motivation was the opportunity to be self-sufficient in something. And as anyone who knows, who's gotten into gardening and maybe grown your own herbs, that is a huge joy to become self-sufficient in something. My first thing was honey from bees, so when I hit that self-sufficiency from eggs, I was pretty stoked as well. But something that I do want to note with all of this in adding chooks and quails is that sometimes people underestimate how much work it is, some of the setup cost, and how often they need to be around to care for their chooks and quails. So that's why I wanted to do this 101, just making sure that you had the basics and knew that there is a little bit to it and that there might be a bit of a steep learning curve just at the start there. For anyone who's just really worried about the animal ethics implications of their eggs, I would say there are cheaper and more time-effective ways to check in with how those chooks are treated than keeping your own, and that really, if you're wanting chooks for the backyard, you want them for more than just the eggs. You want to be utilizing that manure as well, and you also might want to be into it in terms of giving the chooks a cuddle here and there. All of that said, let's talk a little bit about what your choices are if you are someone who wants to add some poultry to the backyard. So the obvious is, of course, chooks. Everybody thinks about chickens when they think about adding some feathered friends to the yard. But another one that I'm going to talk about tonight, and a creature I've had myself, is quails. Quails can make a really great small space solution for people living in urban areas. And for anyone who's ever toured Cat Laver's property in the Darebin area, I have to say, I think she's been responsible for inspiring a lot of urban quails in the area. A lot of people are really inspired to see how quiet they are and how well they can fit into the urban setting. That said, there are absolutely other poultry that can be kept as pets and for their eggs. Other examples you see are duck, geese, guinea fowls. One of my neighbors has a peacock that I hear frequently. But for the purposes of focusing on the moorland area, I'd say chooks and quails are probably the most appropriate. Ducks and geese require some wet area, and other creatures can require a little bit more space or might be a little loud for your neighbors. So let's just talk about chooks and quails for now. So first up, chooks, the classic that everyone thinks about. The first thing I want you to do is have a think about whether or not you have the space and the time for chooks, as well as the council regulations in your area. So normally in urban areas, if you're tuning in for moorland in particular, there's restrictions around the number of chickens you can have and whether or not you can have a rooster without a permit. So make sure that's something that you check up front. There are setup costs to consider. So for example, we're going to talk a little bit about what equipment's needed. And then there's ongoing costs in terms of the feeding cost, some of the bedding, and any repairs that are required. Something else you should be aware of is that when people think about getting chooks, they think about the cockle-doodle-doo from the rooster in the morning and how loud that would be. But even if you just have hens, female chooks, there is some noise. So for example, throughout the day, there might be a little bit of clucking. And for some chooks, there could be quite a lot of noise making when they're laying an egg. It's a pretty big task to lay an egg, and so sometimes there could be a little bit of calling out. I haven't found that to be a problem in the urban areas that I've lived in as a renter and now as a homeowner. I haven't found that to be a problem with neighbors. Eggs can go a long way in asking for forgiveness, but I have met some people who have had to give up particularly noisy chooks after a complaint from neighbors. So it's just something to be aware of if you're planning on having your chooks right up against your neighbor's house. Another thing that people often don't realize is that you kind of need to be home a little bit to make sure that you're looking after your chooks. So there are systems that you can set up so that, for example, an automatic solar door opens in the morning and closes at night, but you still do need to check that all of your chooks get in and are nice and tucked away and safe. So for those of you who might, for example, go away a lot on weekends or go away for long periods of time, just have a think in advance about who might be able to help you out. At my house now, I know I go away on a lot of weekends to go hiking when the situation's better than right now. And so I've got some neighbors that I'm ready to ask to come and check on the chooks. It's best if you can have someone lay eyes on your chooks every day. That's the best way to make sure that you're keeping track of their health. Something else people don't realize when they first buy their chooks, and you see a lot of older chooks coming up on rescue sites for this reason, is that they can be quite long-lived. So a chook that a lot of people are familiar with is this one here, the Isa Brown. So Isa Browns are egg-laying machines. I have known of an Isa Brown who laid an egg every day of her life until the day she died. So they are absolutely prolific. They're a hybrid that's been bred specifically for egg-laying conditions, and they only live 3 to 5 years. So a shorter lifespan that doesn't require you to do a lot of planning. Some other varieties of chooks can live much, much longer, say 12, 15, even longer I've heard of. And so be aware when you're getting into this that you might be making a longer term commitment than you first realized, maybe even the lifespan of your dogs. The last thing I want to note here that people often don't realize when they decide to get chooks is that predators are absolutely an issue in urban areas. I've seen a lot of foxes around moorland. They are absolutely there, and so you need to be aware of that in designing your space. So in terms of what you're going to need when you're deciding to get chooks, the first thing to be aware of is you're going to need, of course, a coop. And I'm using this example that I'm showing you here. It's like a 1950s style coop because that's a pretty good example of what you need. You need to be aware of keeping predators out, minimizing the amount of rodents that are getting in, providing enough space for your chooks, making sure the weather is kept off of them. So for example, that it's not getting too hot in summer and too cold in winter, through, for example, breathability, the mesh there. Now, I could talk for days about the coops that are available. You can buy them secondhand, you can build them yourself, and if that's something you're interested in, I highly recommend this resource here. Now, normally I feel a bit silly holding up a For Dummies book, but Building Chicken Coops for Dummies, while a very specific topic, is actually a really great book. I found this very helpful. So that's great for building your own, buying secondhand, buying new, or what I've done at my own house is convert a shed that we weren't using into a coop, which can be a really easy way of doing it. You end up with something quite durable. You'll also need for your chooks nesting boxes, feed in an ongoing way, water stations so that they can have water at all times, roaming area and mulch for their roaming area, making sure that they have enough space to be frolicking around. And you might possibly need a space to separate out any chooks that are being bullied and some first aid equipment. So that's a big long list. Don't get intimidated. I'm going to give you some resources to follow up with. I just want to give you a sense of the 101. For those of you just tuning in, don't forget, post any of your questions in the feed, and I'm going to try and address a bunch of those questions at the end. In terms of choosing a chook, what I really want to encourage you to do is think broadly about the breeds that are available to you. So I showed you before the classic of the Isa Brown, which is what a lot of people associate with the backyard chook, because again, they're egg-laying machines. But you can go really creative. For example, an Aracuna. I love these guys. They lay light blue colored eggs, so you can end up with your own little Easter eggs at home. Or, for example, a very popular backyard chook for people with kids is a silky. They look a little silly, sometimes need a haircut. Or my absolute favorite, so much my favorite that my mother-in-law painted me a portrait of one for my birthday, Wyandottes. I think they're absolutely gorgeous with those scalloped feathers. So the things that you're thinking about in making your choice of chook are eggs. How many are you going to get? What's their size? Even their color. If you want, for example, a dark chocolate egg, then you might go with a French Marin. You're also going to think about the temperament of the chook. Is it a chook that doesn't mind humans as much, or is it one that's a little bit more flighty, for example? And with that, my theory is that how the chook is raised has more to do with their temperament than their breed, but breed does play a role. Flightiness is another factor, a big one in my garden, where I was worried that if I had a chook who could fly really well, she might clear my fence. So that's something to consider, as is size, longevity, how long she's going to live, Instagrammability, if you're into that sort of thing, and of course the price. Some chooks are more expensive than others. You can get Isa Browns really cheap, under $20. Some of the rarer breeds are going to cost you up to, say, maybe $75 if you're really going out there. So I'm conscious that we had someone comment before, I never thought of quails, and I get that response a lot. For years I lived in a rental property in Northcote, and it was quite a small space, but what worked really well there, and apologies, the lights have gone off around me, what worked really well in that space was quails. So instead of chooks, which would have taken up a little bit too much room for what I had, and would have been difficult to design a hutch around, I went with Japanese quails, which are a much, much smaller breed. Now, people think that this is quite unusual, quite strange to have gone with quails, but there's a few reasons I did that. One was I had neighbors really tight on both sides, and I was really worried that chooks might make a bit too much noise. You would never know the quails were there. They are incredibly quiet. They're much smaller, so you need less space to keep them together. They also don't require a coop. They go to sleep wherever they fall at the end of the day when it gets dark. That said, some other things to consider with the quails is they're a lot flightier. So for example, they tend to be not as adapted to humans and might take off and be a little bit more afraid of you than chooks, which might come to want to sit on your lap. So with the quails, there's a whole bunch of different species, but as I mentioned, Japanese quails were the ones that I went with. And that's because I wanted to keep them for their eggs. I wanted to have a whole little flock of Japanese quails. And the big question you get asked about this is, what is the egg laying situation like? One Japanese quail egg, which is quite small, you're going to need 4 of those to equal 1 average chook egg. So I had myself a pair of little quail egg scissors, which I was able to use so that 4 eggs could easily be tossed in and made as scrambled eggs or poached eggs or whatever else I was into. The lifespan of quails is about 3 years, so much shorter than chooks, and in general I find their coop setup to be pretty simple. In terms of where to from here, and please do keep all of your questions coming, I'm seeing some really interesting ones come in that I'm going to address in a second. Where to from here, just really quickly, make sure that you're considering in getting your backyard poultry, how much time do I have and what's the cost going to be? Is that something I'm happy with? Past that, as soon as you're ready to go, plan your site and get your birds. So there are so many resources out there if you're into chooks. Gardening Australia has actually made a whole bunch of really good videos that they've made available online. I recommend checking them out after this session. But there's also so many good books out there. I've showed you this one already, The Contented Chook, which is full of inspiration for good coops and different kinds of chooks that you might want to have. Jackie French's Chook book is absolutely fantastic. It's got really practical advice on how to care for them. And I mentioned before, if you're going to build your own coop, Chicken Coops for Dummies. All really helpful resources, and luckily I was able to get those ones from the library before COVID happened. But a book that I don't have that I'd love to show you is called The Small Space Flock by Harvey Usey. I found that enormously helpful for planning both my quail hutch and later a chicken coop. So check that one out. Quails are a little bit harder to find resources for, but they are out there. I mentioned before Kat Lavers, and there's been a few videos made of her garden, including for Gardening Australia, and that shows you what her quail setup looks like. I think it's a really great example. But on top of that, my number one tip in terms of your go-to resources from here is actually Facebook groups. Because when you first get a chook or a quail, there's always something going on that you're panicking about a lot. It's happened to me, and I've wanted to ask quail questions in the middle of the night. There are a lot of Facebook groups where you can post photos, post questions, and get near instantaneous responses from people who've been keeping chooks and quails for a really long time. So for example, there's Backyard Poultry Australia, Backyard Quails, Backyard Chooks. There's even one specifically for coop inspiration. I will post in the comments here some of my favorite groups to visit, but I highly recommend joining those groups, scrolling through some of the questions. There's a lot of first-timers asking for advice on there, and that can be helpful at getting your head around the whole setup. Now for a few of these questions that people have been posting in, so thanks so much. So here, Fong has shared, I met someone with 11 different breeds of chooks and temperaments. She named them from characters from Game of Thrones. I love that. One of the best parts of my job is getting to meet people's chooks, and I've met Princess Leia and Margaret Hatcher. Naming chooks is one of the most fun parts. All of my quails, when I had them, were named after famous historical female leaders. So I had a Cleopatra, Hashtafoot, all sorts of fun leaders. So absolutely, get creative with your names. Someone's asked here, Fong has asked, can I have quails if I live in an apartment unit? Great question. I've considered this at length, and I thought about whether or not quails could be appropriate for a balcony situation. I think that that might be a little bit stressful for the quails and for you, and it really, a lot of it's going to come down to whether or not you provide them with a deep litter system that gives them something to scratch through during the day so that they're entertained, so that they're happy quails, they're healthy. If you could provide that, for example, in a courtyard situation or in a balcony that gets appropriate light, yes, I can imagine that being done ethically. But it's really going to come down to the space that you have, the light access, because light access is going to determine how many eggs they lay and making sure that they're not too cold, they're not too hot, that they're able to get into the shade frequently. So for me, for my quails, I had them in a constrained area under a fig tree where they were able to get lots of light in winter when it dropped their leaves, but then in summertime it had leaves and provided them with a lot of shade. Absolutely, you can have chooks or quails on top of a concrete base, so long as you provide them with a deep litter system. In fact, that concrete base, for example, in a courtyard, is going to prevent foxes from digging under your fence. Fantastic. But the deep litter, for example, made up of all different materials they can scratch through, is what's going to provide them with that ethical kind of entertainment during the day. So really great question. The next question I've seen is how much space do quails need compared to chooks? Now this is a really contentious one, and it really depends on your ethical tolerance in terms of how much space is required. So for example, just as a quick comparison of size, in a space where I could have ethically kept 3 chooks at my old house, I was able to have a flock of 11 quails. So they are much smaller birds, and they're quite happy to live in these large flocks so long as you kind of introduce them at the right time. But I recommend reading a little bit further about that because it really depends on the size of chook, how many you have, and what sort of environment you're providing for them. The kind of diversity of the environment has as much to do with it as the space. So the difference between them being in a plain wire cage and having a litter system they can scratch through really defines kind of how much space you need to provide for them. Another question here is, you mentioned silkies are good for children, but are there any other recommended breeds for children? Great question from Kimberly. As I mentioned before, Kimberly, I think that the temperament of the chooks has as much to do with how they were raised. For example, being raised when they were younger around people, as it does in regards to the breeds. That said, I really do recommend this book here because it has about 30 different breeds of chooks and maybe a bit more, and it recommends with each of them whether or not they have kind of a gentle temperament. There's also a site online, if you type in like choose my breed of chicken, and you can actually address these are the criteria I have, and it makes recommendations for which chickens would be appropriate for you. But I would say most all chickens can be appropriate for kids, but some tend to be a little bit cuddlier. Pekin Bantams would be another great one to consider. Great for small spaces and really friendly with kids, I find. So I'm conscious of time here, but I'm going to address just one more question, and that's what type of kitchen scraps do chooks like the most? Great question, and this is actually a good opportunity for me to remind that I've been talking a little bit about how chooks could eat your scraps, but they also require, of course, a base feed. So it's essential that chooks don't just eat the scraps coming off the table, but they have a really balanced diet of pellets that you're able to buy from a lot of local pet stores. That said, they can then do a lot of recycling from your kitchen. Just make sure that the food isn't too salty, it isn't too oily, and then that it's taken away if the chooks haven't finished it all, because that's when you're going to attract rodents or wild birds that can be a problem for your chook's health. My big recommendation for adding to their pellets and things coming out of your kitchen and garden is leafy greens, vegetables, and fruit. All of that is perfectly healthy for the chooks and is really, really great to supplement their diet. Now, I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to have to sign off here, but there are so many questions coming in, which is fantastic. I'm going to be responding, typing in my answers, so keep them coming. I'll be online for the next week addressing all of those. So thanks again for tuning in. I'm going to share those resources, and please do keep the questions coming. Thanks, and bye for now.